Let me ask you, the question I hear being talked about and I read being talked about in the Arab world is, have the UAE and Bahrain sold out the Palestinians? In other words, wasn't this meant to be about providing the millions of Palestinians who live in the occupied territories with some kind of political rights, with a state? That has been the reason Arab countries have not recognized Israel for decades and decades, and that the UAE and Bahrain did it without any progress on the Palestinian issue. What do you think the feeling is in the UAE about that?
Farid, thank you for having me on. I mean, first of all, absolutely the Palestinians deserve to have their own state, and it's an issue that globally is recognized. International law says that the settlements in occupied territories are illegal. Nothing that the UAE and Bahrain, for that matter, did changes that. And the Emiratis are very clear, and Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, the UAE foreign minister, in his speech at the White House during the signing ceremony, made that very point and said, we support the Palestinians' right for a state. The issue is that nothing has moved in the right direction for the Palestinians for decades. They signed the Oslo Accords. Over a quarter of a century has passed since any Arab country has signed any sort of agreement or come to any agreement with the Israelis. On the contrary, the Palestinians' plight has only gotten worse. So the question is, does this actually help the situation in the Middle East or not? And what the Emiratis have been clear about is that for them, first of all, a very important move from the Israelis was to halt the annexation of Palestinian lands. In May and June of this year, here in the region, we were all very concerned that the Israeli Prime Minister would go ahead with his decision to annex Palestinian lands, annex the Jordan Valley, which would have been terrible for the Palestinians, but also for the Jordanians.
But now, in that case, Bibi Netanyahu seems to have outplayed the UAE. He threatened something which he never did, and in return for not doing something that he never did, he got a major concession from the UAE. I mean, that doesn't reflect well on the UAE's leadership.
Well, not really, because he didn't do it because there was back-channel talks happening. I mean, the UAE ambassador to the US, Yusuf Al-Ateba, publicly came out in June and said that any steps towards normalization would be halted if annexation went ahead. So it was very clear from the Emirati side that whatever the Gulf countries were thinking would be over if annexation went ahead. So I think we have to see a sequencing here. The second element I think is important is that for the Palestinians, they still have to find a way to get their state, and it's something that not only the UAE, but of course all the Arab countries still stick to the Arab Peace Initiative. That was in 2002. It's been 18 years, and it's a real issue with the international community, actually, and the region, the fact that nothing has happened on the Arab Peace Initiative side, where the Israelis were given a very clear... But it hasn't happened
because Israel hasn't accepted it, and why would Israel accept it? Why would Israel accept it, since the prize in the Arab Peace Initiative was recognition of Israel, and the UAE has provided the prize without Israel recognizing a Palestinian state. So if they're getting the rewards without making the compromise, why would they make the compromise?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, don't forget, API is 57 countries, so it's more than one or two countries. And as far as the Emiratis are concerned, and what they've been saying here and what we're hearing from officials here, is that for them, this was a strategic decision for them bilaterally with Israel, but also looking at the Middle East and looking at ways, how can we change the stagnation that's happened? We've not seen any positive developments towards peace or even allowing the Palestinians a sense of changing the dynamics that we've had on the ground.